Welcome to Mr. Mars Lockdown History. Quick summaries about a range of different historical events. Today we're going back to one of the major events that shaped Germany after World War I, which was the Spartacist Revolt. This was a major left-wing protest, an attempt by some to overthrow the German government and make major changes in Germany. To understand what happened in the Spartacist Revolt, which took place in January of 1919, it's important to know what happened in Germany at the end of the war. Germany's leader, the Kaiser, had abdicated, and some left-wing Germans hoped that a communist Germany would take its place, although this wasn't what happened. Protests continued throughout the November and December of 1918, and indeed after one protest, a police chief in Berlin refused an order to shut down much of the protest. As a result, this police chief was removed by the government from his post. He called for major protests against the government, and huge numbers turned out, surprising even the people that had organised the event. As a result, a major protest and strike was called for Monday the 7th of January. 500,000 people would ultimately turn out in Berlin for these protests, showing huge support for what the protesters were demanding and potential change to the government. These protesters were involved in a variety of actions. Some of them tried to persuade members of the military to join them, although ultimately failed to do this. Others set up barricades throughout Berlin to try and stop them being stopped in their protests, and others occupied buildings, including newspapers that had been critical of the protesters. Some people wanted action to end this, and as a result of this the government turned towards the Freikorps. The Freikorps were a right-wing group of former military men who were known for their extreme violence. Many of them still had their weapons from during the Great War. There was demand from many of the middle class in Germany, newspapers, and also members of the government that the Freikorps should be sent in. Indeed, some newspapers demanded they be sent in to kill the protesters if needs be. This was because many people had a real fear that there could be a communist revolution in Germany, started by this. Eventually, the Chancellor, Friedrich Ebert, made the decision to send in 3,000 members of the Freikorps. The Freikorps ultimately quickly overcame the protesters, using their extreme experience and often violence. More than 200 people, mostly protesters, were killed during the violence. The most extreme violence was reserved for some of the leaders. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were two leaders of the Spartacists. Karl Liebknecht was shot, and ultimately his body was dumped outside a morgue. Rosa Luxemburg suffered an even more violent fate, where she was brutally attacked and then her body dumped in the canal. Ultimately this brought to an end the Spartacist Revolt, and at that point the threat of major left-wing revolution in Germany.